Hey everybody, Dr. O here, and in this video on the cardiac cycle, I'm going to be going through the 5 phases of the cardiac cycle and breaking down what's happening with regard to pressure changes in each of the heart chambers and the effects that those pressure changes are going to be having on the valves. So, let's get started. So as I said, when we evaluate what's happening with each of the phases of the cardiac cycle, we're particularly concerned with what's happening in the chambers with regard to pressure. And the reason why that's so important is because pressure is going to be what drives the opening and closing of the heart valves. So starting off with atrial systole, our pressure in our atria is going to be high, and the pressure in the ventricles is going to be low. The AV valves will be open and the semilunar valves are going to be closed. Now, why is that? So why do we have high atrial pressure in atrial systole? It has to do with the fact that we have blood in the atria. And wherever blood goes, it's going to create some pressure. So just taking up space is going to create pressure. The other reason why we have high pressure in the atria during atrial systole is that the atria are contracting. And so that too is going to create pressure in that system. So these are reasons why we're going to see high atrial pressure. Now we've got low ventricular pressure. So why is that? Well, the ventricles during atrial systole don't have any blood in them. And that's going to mean that without that mass of blood, there's not going to be any pressure associated with that. The other reason why we have low ventricular pressure is that the ventricles are in diastole. They're in their relaxation phase. So no pressure. Now, what are the effects that these pressures are going to have on the valves? Well, we just previously stated that the AV valves are open. So why is that? Well, it has to do with the high pressure in the atria and the low pressure in the ventricles. So we know what's creating the high pressure in the atria. It's that we've got blood in there and we have atria that are undergoing contraction. So this pressure differential between the high pressure in the atria and the low pressure in the ventricles is going to be what drives the valves open, forces the valves open. Now the semilunar valves are going to be closed, and I didn't include a row in here pertaining to the great vessel that's attached to either ventricle. But when it comes to the semilunar valves, we have to be mindful of the ventricle's relationship with the great vessel attached to it, because that's what the semilunar valve is regulating, the relationship and the flow of blood from the ventricle into the semilunar valve. Now, in particular, we're really concerned with the left ventricle and the aorta. So moving forward, I'm going to be talking about the ventricles and the aorta with regard to pressure changes, the relative pressures in each of these areas. So the semilunar valves are going to be closed, and the reason why is that we've got a high pressure in the aorta. The cardiovascular system, the system of systemic circulation, is a high pressure system. And we need that pressure in the system to help move the blood along. And we're going to be learning about that in the next unit. But for now, trust me that that is the case. So what's in the aorta is blood under high pressure. And in atrial systole, we've got ventricles with low pressure, that low pressure being due to the fact that there's no blood and the ventricles are in diastole. So this pressure difference between the ventricle and the aorta is going to be what forces the semilunar valves closed. Now we're into ventricular systole, the first phase. Now, when we look at what's happening in the ventricles, there's usually a couple of big events. And so anatomists, physiologists like to divide ventricular systole into 2 general phases, and then they also like to kind of divide up diastole. So we'll talk about that when we get there. So in the first phase of ventricular systole, we're going to see that we have low pressure in the atria, low but building pressure in the ventricles, so we might consider that like an increasing pressure in the ventricles. Our AV valves are essentially going to be closed, and I'm going to explain why I put eventually there, and the semilunar valves are going to be closed. So let's see, why do we have low atrial pressure? Well, in the previous phase, we emptied the atria of blood, so there's no blood in the atria at this point. The other reason why we have low atrial pressure is because the atria are in diastole. They're relaxed, so not creating any pressure there. Now, why do we have increasing pressure in the ventricles at this point? Well, it's because we've got blood in the ventricles, and we know that wherever blood is, it's going to create pressure in the container. So we've got blood in the ventricle, and we've got an increasing pressure because the ventricles in first phase are just starting to contract. So that's how we can think of this in this first phase. So what's happening with our valves? Well, we know that the AV valves are closed, and this deserves a little bit of explanation. So when we're talking about the AV valves being open or closed, generally speaking, they will be closed during the first phase of ventricular systole. Now, at the very, very, very beginning, they might be open for a split second, but very quickly, as the pressure differential between the atria and the ventricle kicks in, the AV valves are going to be closed. So, what's driving that closure? Well, we've got a high pressure in the ventricles and a low pressure in the atria. So the high pressure in the ventricles is due to the fact that we have that volume of blood that's been transferred into the ventricles, and we've got the ventricles going into their contracted state. So these two things are going to drive the pressures up, and that's going to be what causes the AV valves to close, the pressure of the blood coming up against those AV valves causing them to close. Now the semilunar valves are also going to be closed, and this is due to the same reasons we saw before. A high pressure in the aorta and a low pressure in the ventricles, and it is a lower pressure in the ventricles at this point. It's not that the ventricles don't have any pressure. They have an increasing pressure in first phase systole, but it's still not great enough to overcome the pressure that is in the aorta. So that distinction needs to be made. Now, I want to point out something during this ventricular systolic first phase. We notice that we have both the AV valves and the semilunar valves closed, just for a brief moment, just for a brief moment. And when we see that, that means that the ventricles are closed chambers, completely closed chambers. And so, of course, anatomists, physiologists have a name for that, and it's called isovolumetric contraction. The contraction refers to the fact that this is occurring during the contraction phase in the ventricles. Now we're moving on into ventricular systole. This is the second phase of ventricular contraction. So what's happening here? Well, we're still going to have low atrial pressure, but now we're going to have high ventricular pressure. The AV valves are going to remain closed, but at this point, particularly towards the end of this second phase of systole, we're going to see those semilunar valves opening. So what's going on with all of this? Why do we have low atrial pressure? Well, we've got low atrial pressure because we don't have any blood in the atria, and because the atria are still in diastole. So why do we have high ventricular pressure? Well, it's because we've got that full volume of blood in there, and now the ventricles are in a full-out contraction. So what's going on with the valves? Well, we know the AV valves are closed because we've got high pressure in the ventricles and low pressure in the atria, and that high pressure in the ventricles is due to the volume of blood as well as ventricular systole. But the semilunar valves are going to be open. Now, why is that? Well, it's because finally the ventricles have created a pressure that is higher than what we see in the aorta. That's why. And this is due to the volume of blood that's in the ventricles as well as that ventricular contraction. All right, so now here we are in the ventricular diastole, the first phase of it, at least the onset, I should say. And what we're going to have here is, increasing pressure in the atria. We're going to have low pressure in the ventricles. Our AV valves are going to be closed, and our semilunar valves are closed. So why do we have increasing pressure in the atria? Well, ever since we had the end of atrial systole, the atria have been filling passively with blood. Now, initially, that wasn't that big a deal. There wasn't that much blood being returned to the atria at this point. But now that we're getting towards the end of the whole cardiac cycle, we're in the 4th phase of the 5 phases before we get back to atrial systole. We're getting to the point where the atria have had enough time to get a little bit of blood in there. So we're going to start to notice that we're having an increase in pressure in the atria, and that's the reason. So it's that passive filling that's been happening all this time. We're going to have low ventricular pressure because the ventricles are empty. They ejected the blood that was in them in the previous phase. And the ventricles are also in their relaxation phase. They are in diastole. Now the AV valves are going to be closed. Now why is that? Particularly when we know that we have low atrial pressure and low ventricular pressure. Well, there could be a couple of reasons for this. Keep in mind that we are talking about the onset, kind of like the moment just at the beginning of this cycle as we transition into it. And it could be that initially the pressure differential between the atria and the ventricles isn't enough to drive the ventricles open. And it could also simply be that the ventricles that drive the AV valves open. But it could also simply be enough that the AV valves just haven't had an opportunity yet to respond to the pressure changes that are occurring. The semilunar valves are closed for the reason that semilunar valves are closed, which is that there's high pressure in the aorta and a relatively low pressure in the ventricles. Now before we move on, I'm going to draw your attention to this part of the table. Yet again, we have a moment where our AV valves are closed along with our semilunar valves. And previously, when we were in ventricular systole, we called this an isovolumetric moment. And because we were in systole, we called it isovolumetric contraction. This time, because it is in a diastolic phase, we're going to be calling this isovolumetric moment isovolumetric relaxation. And now we're into the final phase of our cardiac cycle, the ventricular diastole late phase. So what's happening here is that we've got high pressure in the atria. We're going to have low pressure in the ventricles. The AV valves are going to be open and the semilunar valves are going to be closed. So what's driving this high atrial pressure? Well, we're going to have a pretty full couple of atria. That's what we got. And all that blood is going to create pressure. Whenever you have blood starting to show up in enough mass, it's going to create pressure. So the high pressure in the atria at this point is caused by the mass of blood that has been returned to the heart, basically. We're going to have low ventricular pressure because the ventricles don't have any blood in them and because the ventricles are still in diastole. So what's happening with our valves? Well, the AV valves are going to be open, and the reason why the AV valves are open is because we got that high pressure in the atria, and which is filled with blood, and low pressure in the ventricles. And that pressure differential that we see in the chamber from one chamber to the next one is going to be what drives those valves open. Semilunar valve is closed for the reason that semilunar valves are closed, which is that we have high pressure in the aorta and low pressure in the ventricles. Now before we wrap up this table, I want to put in a couple of other things. I actually want to show when the atria are in diastole and systole, and the same thing for the ventricles. So we know that when the atria are in systole, that this is the amount of time that the atria are going to be in systole. Now, the table is not representative of times. I'm just kind of giving you a reference point. And then the rest of the time, the atria are going to be in diastole. So there's a short period of time in the cardiac cycle when the atria will be contracted, and then a much, much longer time when they will be relaxed. Now, for the ventricles, it's a little bit different story. Certainly, the ventricles are going to be relaxed when the atria are contracting. But the ventricles are going to be during kind of 2 columns worth of area in their contraction phase, and then the rest of the time they're going to be in diastole. So the thing that's true about either chamber is that they spend most of their time in diastole, very little time in systole. All right, so let's answer some questions. So when do the AV valves open? Well, if we look at our chart, we can see that the AV valves are open in atrial systole, but if we go all the way to the end, we can see that they're also open in late ventricular diastole. Now, ventricular diastole feeds into atrial systole. So the answer would actually be that when the pressure first starts to build in the atria during ventricular diastole late phase, that is when the AV valves open. So when do the semilunar valves open? Well, the semilunar valves are going to open once the pressure in the ventricle is great enough, and that occurs in the latter part of the second phase of ventricular systole. So based on these two questions, what condition must be met for a valve to be open? So if we look at what we've got, in atrial systole, we've got a high pressure in the atria and a low pressure in the ventricle. And so blood is coming from the atria into the ventricles, so that from-to arrangement, high to low, works here. Now it's a little bit harder to see what's happening during the ventricular systole, because the thing that we don't get to see on this table is I did not include the pressure that the ventricle has to overcome with regard to the aorta. But the thing that I can tell you is that during the second phase of ventricular systole, the pressure in the ventricle is going to be high enough that it overcomes the pressure in the aorta. So it's still that sort of from to high low arrangement that is going to drive these semilunar valves open. So to answer this question, we would say that it has to be a relative high-low pressure relationship between the chambers where the blood is coming from and where it is going to. All right, how about a true-false question? The chambers are in diastole together about half the time. Well, let's look at our chart. So we know that the atria are here in diastole and the ventricles are here in diastole, and that is about half the time that the atria are in diastole, so I'm going to say that's true. How about this one? Only the semilunar valves open, only the semilunar valves opening spans 2 cardiac phases. Well, here we can see the semilunar valves are open only in the second phase of ventricular systole, so that is going to be false. But what about the AV valves? We can see that the AV valves start to open at the end of ventricular diastole, and they actually remain open through atrial systole. So for the AV valves, that statement would actually be true, but not so for the semilunar valves. Isovolumetric relaxation occurs in first phase ventricular systole. So this question is asking you, how do you name an isovolumetric moment? Well, you want to look at where it's located. So this one is in systole, and then this one is in diastole, and if we're talking about the first phase, which is in systole, we would not call it relaxation, we would call it contraction, so the answer to that would be false. Isovolumetric relaxation occurs in the diastolic onset in the ventricles. All right, another one. Let's see. The aortic valve remains closed due to blood pressure in the arteries. If I had more room on this slide, the way I would have phrased this question is like this. The aortic valve remains closed most of the time due to the blood pressure in the arteries being greater than the pressure in the ventricles. And that is true. And with that, my friends, we are done. I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.